I'm Joy Chu, a former scientist turned content creator, and the goal of my YouTube channel is to help people discover the joy of cooking with science. For today's video, I thought it would be fun to make some chocolate chip cookies while sprinkling in some cookie science along the way. My recipe and much of the science I'll be sharing is adapted from Kenji Lopez Alt and will be linked in the description below. So here's a question right off the bat. Why add miso to perfectly good chocolate chip cookies? The answer is it's all about flavor. Miso adds a bit of savory and umami to round out the sweetness and highlight some really interesting nutty, chocolatey flavors. So it's great for balancing taste and providing intrigue to something that can easily taste one-dimensional. Now that we've talked about some of these amazing flavors, let's do some actual baking. To start out, I'm going to make some brown butter. In my book, every cookie needs brown butter because it adds really lovely nutty aroma and it's super easy to make. I've cut up a stick of butter at room temperature into half-inch pats, and I'm heating it in a small pot over medium-low heat. You can stir it a little to help it melt faster. After about 5 minutes or so, you'll notice that the butter starts to bubble vigorously. So what's happening here? Butter contains fat, water, and a little bit of milk proteins and sugar. After the fat melts, the heat goes to evaporate the water. An easy way to tell when the browning begins is when the pot starts to quiet down and you see more small bubbles at the surface. The water has mostly evaporated at this point, and the heat starts breaking down the proteins and sugars that then react with one another like the domino effect. This is called the Maillard reaction, the official term for browning. You see the copper-colored milk solids at the bottom of the pot? They're the good stuff that makes brown butter smell and taste wonderful. Once you see those brown bits, you'll want to take the pot immediately off the stovetop to prevent them from burning. I usually transfer the butter to a heat-proof bowl to stop the cooking process.
So what's the difference between using melted butter versus solid butter? Melted butter makes your cookies denser and more chewy, which is my preferred texture. If you want a more airy cookie, you can cool the brown butter in the fridge until it solidifies like this, and then cream it with the sugar later. Whipping solidified butter with sugar introduces little air pockets that give cookies more lift. I'm going to set the melted butter aside for now and combine the dry ingredients. I usually like to use all-purpose flour, or if I'm feeling a bit fancy, a mix of all-purpose and dark rye flour, which adds more nuttiness. But for today, I'm just going for all-purpose. I'm using 200 grams. For leavening, I'm going to add half teaspoon baking soda. Baking soda is what we call a base that reacts with an acid to make carbon dioxide, which gives cookies lift. The acid from this recipe comes from brown sugar, which we'll get to later. Next, I'm going to add half teaspoon table salt. You don't need a whole lot here because we're going to add miso later, which has more salt content. Now I'm just going to combine all of these dry ingredients and set it aside.
Now for the wet ingredients. First, I'm putting in an egg and an egg yolk. The extra yolk adds more moisture and fat to make the cookies tender and fudgy. Next, I'm adding 75 grams of granulated sugar and 1 teaspoon vanilla extract. And then I'm going to whisk all of this for 2 to 3 minutes at medium-high speed until foamy. You have to dissolve as much of the sugar here as possible because it makes caramelization happen much more easily during baking. Caramelization occurs when the sugars break down, turning them a beautiful brown color and imparting a sweet, nutty flavor. Now I'm going to switch to the paddle attachment and add the brown butter and 25 grams of shiro miso. I like to use the light colored miso because it's more mild, but if you like bold flavors, you can go for red or darker miso. Then I'll add 100 grams of brown sugar and mix very briefly on low until everything is just combined. Brown sugar absorbs moisture from its surroundings more readily than white sugar, which means cookies with brown sugar will be more moist than those with only white sugar. For textural contrast, you want to leave some of the sugar undissolved to create different pockets of caramelization. So adding the brown sugar at this later stage keeps some of the sugar intact.
Now it's time to add the dry ingredients I combined earlier and mix on low for about 15 seconds. You want to mix all of this very briefly because overmixing can turn your cookies from soft and pleasantly chewy to unpleasantly tough due to too much gluten development. Finally, the moment we've all been waiting for, the chocolate. I'm adding in 4 ounces of chopped dark chocolate and folding it in gently for another 5 seconds. You can use regular chips, but I prefer chocolate chopped into uneven chunks and shards because they eventually turn into those gorgeous pools and ribbons of melted chocolate.
So now I'm done mixing this delicious looking dough. And here's where we hit controversy. To refrigerate or not to refrigerate? I know it's hard to wait for something as delicious as warm, freshly baked cookies, but in this case, there's a big benefit to waiting. The longer you refrigerate, the more flavor your cookies will have. During this resting phase, tiny things called enzymes will break down the proteins and sugars in the flour to allow for browning. Remember the Maillard reaction from making brown butter earlier? That's going to happen again during baking. So the more you allow the proteins and sugars to break down, the more delicious your cookies are going to be. As a personal preference, I usually like to chill my dough in the fridge overnight. But since I imagine we probably don't want to sit here and wait around for the next 16 hours or so, I'm going to use my secret stash that's already been chilled in the fridge.
I just preheated the oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit and am now going to shape the cookies. Each cookie dough ball is about golf ball sized, and I'm using an interesting technique by Baking Illustrated. Basically, you break the balls in half and smush the halves back together for extra textural contrast.
Okay, I just shaped the cookie dough balls, and the oven is preheated, which means yes, it is time to bake the cookies. But before we do, there's something interesting that I discovered. After baking them on an aluminum baking sheet versus a pizza steel, I actually prefer the pizza steel. My ideal cookies are slightly firm and crisp on the outside and moist and fudgy on the inside. And somehow the pizza steel just gets the job done right.
So back to the cookies. The steel has been in the oven and it's pretty hot. So when I'm ready to bake, I lay a piece of parchment paper on top and 8 balls of dough, oh so carefully. It takes me about 6 minutes to bake the cookies, but since every oven and pan can be different, you need to look at visual cues. For my ideal cookies, you're looking for edges that are barely browned and firm, and a center that looks fairly gooey. When you take the cookies out, they'll seem really soft and fragile, and you may start wondering whether you should leave them in the oven longer. Resist the temptation to keep baking, and I promise you'll thank me later. Another thing, I know you'll want to eat them straight away, right out of the oven, but sprinkling them with a little bit of coarse salt and letting them rest does wonders. These cookies are kind of like a juicy steak. They taste much better with a little more time to settle.
You can see that after the cookies have rested a little, they firmed up a bit from the residual heat. And now it's time for the best part of the video, getting to eat these delicious cookies. Hopefully there will still be some by the time I finish recording, but we'll see. If you're intrigued by miso chocolate chip cookies, check out the link in the description below for my recipe. For more cookie science, I've also included the Serious Eats article that I've turned to as a resource time and time again. If you enjoyed watching this video and want to keep learning the science of everyday cooking, like and subscribe below. Thanks for watching, and see you in a couple of weeks. Ooh. Woo!